Sidewalk Labs is this amazing opportunity to bring a bunch of technologists together with a bunch of urbanists to take advantage of the amazing things that technology has to offer with a deep understanding about what really makes cities tick.
Instead of saying a problem is just about technology or it's just about policy, in most cases the answer is it's both. We find the very best people in the world who can go and think about solving those types of problems.
We're very glad to have you join us tonight and to be here at our Sidewalk Talk event. We really see these Sidewalk Talk live events as a chance for urbanists and technologists to come together and to talk about the biggest questions facing cities. And obviously that question tonight is about the future of retail. What is it going to look like in the digital age? More importantly, how are those transformations going to kind of spill over into the street, change the city, and what can we do to make sure that that change is positive and inclusive for the city? So that is something we think about a lot here at Sidewalk Labs. We've thought about it a lot over the past year, and we're very glad to have you here tonight to continue that conversation. We're going to get started in a moment here, but I wanted to give two quick housekeeping notes. If you're going to tweet about the event, which we encourage, it's hashtag Sidewalk Talk. And if you are thinking about asking a question throughout the evening, we're going to have a rolling question submission using our audience participation tool called Slido. You just go to slido.com, type in the event code retail. Throughout the night, at any point in time, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so digitally. You can also upvote somebody else's question if you're not really into typing complete sentences or that kind of thing. Either one is fine, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the panel. So that's available all throughout the evening. Now I want to bring up our moderator for this evening, Vanessa Quirk, the editorial manager here, who I have to say has really done a tremendous job bringing this whole program together and really helping to guide the street life after retail exploration that we did at Sidewalk. If you haven't checked out the blog post, by the way, you should do that at some point as well. So take it away, Vanessa.
Oh, I have a lab. So.
You have a lab.
I am Michael's. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Eric, for introducing. So I just want to give a little introduction to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So like Eric said, here at Sidewalk, we spend a lot of time thinking about the future of cities. But specifically, we think a lot about how we can create future cities that aren't just tech forward and efficient, but also diverse and vibrant. So a lot of times when you think of the neighborhood of the future, you're going to think immediately of self-driving cars or shiny new buildings, and those are important. But we think it's the connective tissue. It's the streets and the sidewalks that are truly the hallmarks of great cities. And we think that because it's on the street where people converge, people converse, and you exchange, and it's not just goods and services, it's thoughts and ideas and opinions. And retail, throughout human history, has been a pivotal generator of urban street life. I mean, it would seem that it has been that way until maybe now. Because if you've been keeping up with the headlines, you'd be forgiven for thinking that maybe retail is dead, right? Every shopping mall that closes, every big chain that fails, it just seems to confirm the narrative. But of course, the story is not so simple. Yes, online shopping has disrupted the day-to-day operations of retail across the US. But in some places and in some sectors, retail is actually growing. And from pop-ups to makerspaces to experience stores, retail is changing rapidly and dramatically. So the big question then, what does this mean for the future of our cities? And that is the question that led a bunch of team members here at Sidewalk Labs to come up with 5 provocative scenarios for the future of urban retail. And what we hope is that these scenarios push cities and companies and everyone in this room to think very carefully about what retail can be in the digital age. And more importantly, how we can shape it for the good of our cities. So that's really what our conversation is all about tonight. And so to give you a bit of a more detailed understanding of that thinking and those scenarios that we came up with, I'm going to introduce you to Eric Baczuk, our Designer-in-Residence here at Sidewalk Labs. Like a lot of sidewalkers, Eric has had a career that's kind of straddled both tech and urban worlds. He holds a master's in architecture and design. And before coming to Sidewalk Labs, he worked at Google, where he was the design lead for a special projects group focused on innovation in urban infrastructure and the built environment. So please welcome Eric Baczuk to the stage.
Yeah. Right on, thanks. Did anyone see the blog post? Did anyone get a chance to read that, any of the 5 fictions? Okay, good. So there's some people reading it. Thank you. So yeah, my name's Eric Baczuk. For me, this project started earlier this year, actually. I was walking down some random street in Soho and got to an intersection and noticed it was like strangely quiet. And I looked up and I realized that all 4 corners of that intersection had vacant retail spaces with the signs, retail space available in the window. And that really got me thinking, like, wow, is this really this pervasive of a problem? And it's kind of one of those things that once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. And as I've been walking around the city ever since, I'm always noting these retail spaces available in streets all over the city, a lot like this. There's a great map that was done by vacantnewyork.com. I'm not sure any of you have seen this. It's also a great and very related blog post. That articles where all the retail vacancies are in the city, and there's like literally thousands of them. And what we're seeing fundamentally is a mismatch between supply and demand. So on the supply side, we have often very large footprint spaces. You have landlords that are charging really incredible per square foot rates and looking for really long-term rents. They're looking for 5- and 10-year terms. On the demand side, you have a lot of startups and smaller businesses who are just completely uncomfortable with signing up for something for 5 or 10 years down the road. They don't have millions of dollars at their disposal, and they're not looking for 10,000 square feet to fill out with their kitchen utensils or whatever it is that they're selling. And so really, if you look at the underscore or the underlying fact of all this, it comes back to technology, really shaping the way that we buy things, shaping what we buy, shaping how we buy it, how it's delivered. And so that really got us thinking about this bigger question: as more retail transactions move online, what does this mean for the street? And so we didn't really ever think we had the answer to this. It was mostly just an exercise to understand what were the right questions to be asking. And so we employed design fiction to really explore possible futures of what things might be, not to be predictive in any sense, but just to really create devices for conversation. And so the design fiction drivers were really focused on look at extrapolating technology, so things that are near term today and really viable, not completely fantasy fiction in terms of like technology that's not realistic or science fiction. Extrapolating social trends, so purchasing more and more online, overnight deliveries, things like that, the way people are buying and consuming. Weak signals. I like to think of weak signals as kind of like online dating in the 90s. It's like there was a small fringe group of people that were doing it and they're a bit weird, and now today, like, you ask anyone in their 20s, almost anyone has used like Bumble or Tinder or something. And then the wild cards are just the completely unpredictable events that are completely unlikely, but somehow happen. So that's also a factor to be considering when you're making these fictions. So one of the first design drivers we picked up on was this high-touch customer engagement. That's something we're seeing in stores like Apple and Nike, where there's a very high ratio of service staff to patrons. And we thought that was kind of cool and kind of luxurious and something that we'd like to see more of in the future. With personalization and customization, you're seeing a lot more of this too. Nike ID is trying to make this more available to broader folks, but high-end companies like Louis Vuitton and Burberry are getting quite serious about this customization piece. 3D body scanning technology is something that's coming a long ways, and the idea of having completely bespoke garments is something that's not such a distant future anymore. And we have robotic fabrication and looms like this. You can actually imagine a world where your clothes could be manufactured on demand or even like while you wait. And so this is really what fed into the upscaled scenario. And so the inside of the store looks a bit like this, where you have like high, like one-to-one kind of customer engagement. You have like a bespoke style advisor, maybe it comes along with you. You have like custom cocktails made there. Maybe AI is like driving their preferences because it knows like your profiling and help make very predictive decisions about the kind of style choices you may be making. There's a loom in the background. You can see where your clothes are actually getting made on demand. And once you have the thing made, you have this cute little leather-bound delivery bot that follows you down the street like a dog as kind of like an icon piece. So if that's what's happening in the store, what does that mean for the street? which is really what we were primarily focused on. And in this scenario, we're kind of thinking that shopping kind of becomes an enclave of the really wealthy. You know, if you're a middle or low class income earner, maybe you're getting all your deliveries done online, and so all your essentials are coming to you directly through mail. And so being able to have the leisure time to kind of stroll the streets and walk around is something that only really privileged can afford. And so in this scenario, the street is kind of negatively affected by the onset of this future fiction. For the next scenario, we were looking at pop-up shops and the idea of like more agile retail locations, and also some like strange juxtapositions. So this is a picture I took in Sydney recently, where you can see a tailor, like for fine tailored men's shirts, next to a bar, and there's also a coffee shop on this side. So there's actually 3 different providers existing in the exact same retail space. I thought that was kind of interesting. As well as this notion of robotic furniture. This is Bumblebee Robotics and OasesRE Systems, which are introducing in the residential space the notion of reconfigurable environments. And so it makes a lot of sense in resi, but it might also make sense in retail. And so that led us into the mutable markets concept, where you could have 2 different retailers sharing the exact same footprint, and maybe throughout the course of the day you could have radical transformation between the two stores. So you can imagine like a SoulCycle or something existing in the daytime, and then in the evening it converts into a bar. And so like these robotic transformable spaces and storage capabilities could facilitate this. And from a business standpoint, it may be a lot easier to take on the rent of only renting it for half the time, as opposed to taking on the rent for the entire duration of the day. From a street perspective, this makes for a more engaged streetscape throughout the day. So, you know, there's a classic syndrome of financial districts where they're bustling from hours of 8 to 5, and then after that it just becomes a complete ghost town. Is there a way that you can kind of reprogram these spaces so you can encourage urban vitality throughout the course of the day? For the next one, I was really excited about this, what I've been calling the atomization of style, which I think maybe I just completely invented and no one knows what that means. But it's the idea that like style has become so fractured into genres and subgenres these days that it's not just like you're either into the Beatles or the Stones. Like there's like a million different possibilities in that spectrum, and that's pervaded across fashion and art and design and culture. And so we're getting like to these very like small niche markets, and so we need small niche providers to meet these markets. And so that's a trend I think we're seeing, and that's leading to these more specialized shops that are catering to these smaller subgroups. As well as the maker movement, I think this is a very important trend that could be really interesting for production and small-scale manufacturing, and the capability of 3D printers, and as I mentioned earlier, design looms. And this really fed into the concept of the indie guild, which seems to be completely in line with some things we're already seeing in the city, and I think we're going to hear more about that later. But the notion that you have makers coming together where they have a place where they can make and sell their products in the same location. Maybe there's certain infrastructure that helps them cross the barrier. So for instance, 3D printing, or if there's any specific loom or overhead technology that a typical small business wouldn't be able to afford, maybe that could be provided by the place. They could host events here and have like really short-term engagement. So you could come in and maybe produce something for like a month and try out a completely wacky idea and see if it gains any traction. And if it does, then great, you're off to the races. You have a brick and mortar shop to sell it in. And if not, you didn't really lose very much. On the street, what does this mean? I kind of hope this could lead to like a really vibrant intermixing of completely radical different styles like coming into one place. I think that's exciting to think of that. And maybe even there's this notion of a district. Like we used to have like the garment district or the meatpacking district, which are kind of just like geographies today, but they're not really functionally performing as such anymore. And it'd be kind of neat to like revitalize that sort of urban landscape where like different neighborhoods have a distinct feel for what is being produced there. For the fourth fiction, this is really tapping into these we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like kind of anti-commercial, anti-corporate sentiment, which is actually very real among today's youth and something we don't really like to talk about too much, but is very evident and very present. Also, like this notion of underserved communities, like funding is always a huge issue of contention and lack of social services. So what if we kind of like tapped into this vein that's very present in society today and kind of mashed it up with robot cleaning and maintenance? So this is like a great idea for reducing costs in the operations of buildings. As well as like online bookability of shared spaces. There's a company called Breather. Have you guys ever heard of Breather? Really cool, just like a place that you can have a quiet room in the city to do your work or read a book or think or whatever. It's a bookable part of the city. So mashing those all up, we came up with this notion of community commons. And this was really taken from a wildflower school. They're a startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They spun out of MIT. But wildflower is essentially just storefronts that have been converted into small Montessori schools. So that's kind of an example of this happening in the real world today. And it couldn't just be limited to schools. There could be other social services provided. It could be a public kitchen or a senior center. You can imagine all the different social services that maybe could occupy these low rent or abandoned retail spaces on the ground floor, much better than having nothing there today. So we're actually giving back to the community and engaging the street front in a different way. And for the last one, I really wanted to draw attention to this increasing income inequality we're seeing. It's kind of a cheesy cartoon, but it's a real thing. And also this notion of trading experience for low prices. I think we're seeing this a lot in retail. I love this image because I can't really tell if this guy works here or if he's a customer. Where you're kind of blurring that boundary from the customer experience and everyone just trying to fight for the lowest price. There's a robotic warehouse management. There's Kiva Robotics and ClearPath are working a lot with Amazon to have all their inventory and warehousing done robotically. And so, in the age of that plus self-driving vehicles, you see the whole supply chain getting automated and digitized in a really interesting way. And so we always like to fantasize this and make an idealized future, but what if we got a bit dystopian with it all and saw that this could maybe result in Truck Mart, which is this parking lot essentially. Imagine Costco sold the building and sold off most of the property and just kept the parking lot. And now these trucks can deliver autonomously into the parking space and robots unpack the crates and pallets and deliver it to people who pre-ordered online and they show up with their car and get their car loaded with whatever they purchased online. It's like the lowest price is the law kind of mode of future urbanism and retail. And I think it's not meant to be predictive, like I said, but it's a possible future that we should be talking about because it's provocative and something we need to confront and deal with in a serious way. From a street level perspective, obviously this is a bit inhumane and not at all the way we want to take things, but I think there's this dark side of self-driving technology that we don't really address all the time, and so it's important to bring this up. So those are the 5 fictions. If you guys have any questions, we can bring them up in the question period at the end, or you can grab me afterwards if there's anything specifically you want to talk about, or poke me in the eye if you don't like them or something. Is this going to?
I think we're ready to. Thank you.
All right.
So I think we'll get to delve into the topic more broadly even further with the panelists. So I'd like to invite you guys up to the stage, please. Eric, am I supposed to be here? Is that where the iPad is here? Or can I move it?
Yeah, you can use that.
But, okay. If it's okay, we're going to put Alana there and Susan there if that's okay. Do you want me to take that off your hands? Cool. Awesome. All right, so just to get started, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists who each have a really interesting perspective that they're going to bring to this topic. So let's start with Alana here. So Alana is the co-founder and CEO of Bulletin, which is a startup that gives internet brands the opportunity to sell their products and host in-store experiences in the physical world. She's dedicated her career to helping brands better bridge the gap between online and offline engagement, and we're very pleased to have you here with us. Okay, next up we have Susan. Susan Fine is the principal of Oases Real Estate. She most recently navigated the hurdles of designing, leasing, building, and managing Turnstile, which is an underground marketplace at Columbus Circle, which you may have wandered through at some point. The project was the first privately financed project within the MTA's subway system. And she was also responsible for the retail transformation of Grand Central. So, welcome, Susan. And since we already know Eric Baczuk, we're going to end here with Eric Ho with the introductions. Eric Ho is an architect who founded Miles, which creates commercial storefront spaces for makers, entrepreneurs, and community members. Eric has enabled over 150 pop-ups in over 30 spaces, and he recently co-founded Good Goods, which is a collaborative retail model for shared urban spaces, and it was selected to the startup accelerator Urban X. So, welcome, Eric. Okay. So to get started, I feel that I have to get the question off the table, the one that I kind of started the introduction with. Is retail dead? Or is it in just some stage in its evolution? Throw it to the panel.
It's changing. What's a store? Is it someplace, is it a souk? Is it what you sell out of? What's a storefront? Is it spilling into a street? And there's 15 million feet of empty space in New York City, and so we're not going to do it all in 400-foot stores, says someone who opened 37 400-foot stores.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's definitely changing. I think we see just a major change in the type of demand for spaces. I think you see a lot of smaller emerging companies that started online that are not looking to sign a 10-year lease, but want something that's flexible and accessible and easy. And yeah, I think you see a major increase in that, and the market just hasn't quite caught up yet. So we see a ton of vacant stores because of that.
I mean, I think depth is relative. So, so I think, it definitely needs a facelift. I think the older commercial leasing perspective is, I think, totally outdated. So how do we do that facelift? You know, with people like ourselves in the panel and you guys. So like, how do we really think about the modern startups and businesses? How do we work with a product that will work well with you know all the changes in in businesses? And I think that what Alana was saying, like 5-10-year lease.
Let's play devil's advocate.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's do that.
How many of you have been in a store, slowed down, turned off your phone, wandered in the last week? Not very many of you. What percentage of your purchases are online? You're a retailer. You want to start a business. What's the cheapest way to start a business? Is it really worth the aggravation? I mean, our grandparents might have wanted to have, sell clothes or, have a laundry. It's a challenging model. And because retail needs traffic, it needs people. But it seems to be very healthy and vibrant in Paris and Tel Aviv and in places where the storefront is more porous, where the doors are open, where you can spill into streets.
So let's talk about that a little bit, about the difference between cities and how you can generate vibrancy and traffic. So whose responsibility is it, do you think, in terms of kind of retail in the public realm? Does it fall on the city to create policies that encourage kind of occupancy, that encourage local businesses? Or does it fall somehow on the responsibility of the retailer to adapt more to demand?
You're not going to say landlord?
Landlord and retailer.
I mean, I think, oh, you go.
No, please, I talk too much.
I think government definitely does play a role to incentivize. I mean, landlords are the key holders with a lot of spaces, and there's not a lot of incentive for them currently, in New York City at least, and a lot of big cities where rents are soaring. And what are the incentives to make them open up their spaces? What are the incentives to, policy-wise, like how does that really come through? I haven't seen a lot of good examples, but I'm sure there is. Yeah.
To me, it's something I kind of alluded to in the presentation, but this notion of like leisure time is actually really important. And if you have like a lot of people that are working longer hours, have less spare time in their day, do they want to spend it just like sauntering around the aisles, like looking through inventory, or are they going to be much more purposeful and direct about what they're trying to get? Go home, like order it online 5 minutes before they go to bed and know it's going to arrive the next morning. Like that is a lot more attractive solution for a lot of people. So we need to ask, like, do people have time for this? What kind of people have time for this? And what kind of experiences are they going to get in return for exchanging their time to be in this store? Because there's a lot of other means to get things to your house now. You don't need to physically be there. So I think that's a bigger question, is like how people spend their non-working hours.
Well, but look at sneakers. Look at Allbirds. You can get the multicolored, look at me talking about this. Look at the multicolored Allbirds in the store. The store, it's not just the rich people who want bespoke, right? Every kid wants those fancy sneakers. They were waiting in line in my neighborhood. But let's take a step back, because I agree with you about government. Lindsay Harris, who's here, and I have spent a lot of time with small retailers. And the best way to become economic inequality, one of the best ways to become middle class in this country is to open a store. There's very, very few dollars available to teach people how to do and to start a store, to do their accounting, to negotiate a lease. And guess what? No landlord's ever going to do a 1-month lease. It's not worth the aggravation. So it would be very simple not a lot of bucks, certainly not as many bucks as building Hudson Yards, forgive me, for the government to seed this. And it's the gig economy. One of our, Lindsay and I's favorite store is, we have a Japanese, it's their first Japanese food store. They sleep in the store just like all of your great-grandparents did. And government, I think, the other thing is that government has to change the zoning. Think of the commissary model all over Long Island City. They make the food, they sell the food. That industry's clean now. And there are a whole huge bunch of zoning changes which need to happen, and I don't think anybody's thinking about. Am I wrong?
No.
I mean, Eric H. and Alana, I mean, how does it feel to hear when you're listening to Susan talking about, like, it's really incredibly difficult to have short-term leases, that the structures aren't set up that allow kind of for success. When you guys are kind of actively working in the space, attempting to change the system, I mean, how do you respond to something like that? Like, what are the ways that your clients and you guys as companies are kind of trying to confront that challenge?
Yeah, so for us, what we've basically done is split up the supply so it becomes more accessible for smaller brands. So we'll take on like a longer term lease as Bulletin, we'll open a store, and if you are a Shopify seller and want to try out a retail space for 2 months, you can do that with us because it's on a monthly membership. And so I think by like chopping up that supply, it does make it more accessible, it like fills up stores. And I think for a brand, they can test out retail and they can test out what it's like to be in physical space and how their products perform. They can learn from that. It will improve their online experience. And yeah, it just makes it something that they can sign up for the same way you would sign up for like Shopify or an online store.
Yeah, I mean, I think pop-up has been around us for I don't know how long, but like, I think landlords definitely have heard about it. So I think the perception of a shorter term lease is I would say a lot more open in the last, 2-3 years than like, 4 or 5 years ago. So like getting a short term lease is still difficult, but not as difficult as before. And our vision, I think at Goodgoods and Miles, is how do we really look at retail as something fluid, sort of commercial real estate as something fluid, right? Like how do you work with different kinds of spaces and target different kinds of brands and audience, and how do you really manage that platform to allow different things to match and be created according to the audience and demographics. So I think that's, to us, is the a version of the future. How to execute it is another question, but.
And I think a lot of landlords are more open to it now,
yes,
too.
For sure.
Like I would say in the past year for us, like you start to see them kind of, okay, we'll try a 6-month lease, we'll let you try out the space. Something that we've been doing recently is starting with license agreements. So we'll do like a 3 to 6 month pop-up in a space, we'll test it out. If we love the space, then we'll move to a long-term lease. I'm sure, I mean, I wasn't doing this 5 years ago, but I'm sure that like they would not have been open to that. So you do see some more flexibility in people wanting to experiment like with other models, I would say.
But that's a huge amount of work. So let's get back to that 15 million square feet of space and what I like best about your idea and why it might be the responsibility of the retailer. So we have a store named Dogs & Co. Started out as an online store, then it became a fancy dog stuff, does its internet redemption in the back so it doesn't have to have 2 stores, and every Saturday it has dog adoption. It has senior dog adoption. It did a doggy SantaCon a year ago. So I don't know if it's a tailor and a bar, but I know that retailer is claiming our public space, our street, and throwing a lot of dogs on it on a Saturday, which then creates traffic, right? You may not want to go to a store to buy a bottle of wine, but hey, you're going to see a bunch of dogs. You have nothing to do with your kid on a Saturday afternoon. Those are the kind of, so I don't think it's just in the store. And I was fascinated, Eric, by what you said, that still 60% of them are making it and 40% aren't in your latest store. So 40% is a really high failure rate, particularly for people who aren't making a lot of money. And you need chains. Lush sells $250,000 of very smelly soap. But Lush fills a lot of stores and young people like it.
I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is that we set up this event based on the premise that we assume there is a connection, right, between street life, the public realm, and retail. Like, we see that as intimately related with each other. I wonder, to what extent do you see retailers kind of on board with this vision in which they are part and parcel of the urban experience and in fact contribute to the vibrancy of the public realm? Do you see that happening? I mean, you see landlords now perhaps reacting finally to the market pressures. Is there an understanding, as you have Doggy SantaCon on the corner, that these experiences are intimately related to the way that you interact with the street and with public life?
I think we live in a capitalist economy, but there's a passion. And Mindy has a passion for animals, and that passion spills out of her store into our street, albeit an underground street. And if it's a sufficient passion, it hopefully will engage all of you and make you put down your phones and leave your apartments. It's not clear that it will, because we aren't slow. Eric and I were talking before about, I was in France over the summer, and I got really aggravated waiting in line for the butcher because he talked to each customer for 10 minutes. We don't know how to slow down anymore enough to shop and to engage in a public realm.
I agree. I mean, I think it is about that storytelling of who is behind that product, what is their story, how do you translate that to the public. It's not about, I mean, it is about shopping, but it is about, you know, what you're connecting to, like what is the brand behind it? How do you connect the person that's making it as a person? So to us, it's like, how do you connect that human-to-human interaction, you know, between consumers and brand owners, and also medium to larger brands? Like, how do you, as a bigger company, how do you think about that message, and how do you actually genuinely like believe in, you know, you do need to connect with consumers in an authentic level, and like, what does that really mean, and are you really doing it? So I think those are the questions that we pose, and like, you know, and starting from emerging brands is a good place, but also like, how does medium and bigger brands actually do that, and you know, and that's a question for us. Yeah.
I'm really interested in your plug and go, because every time a Arepa Venezuelan food stall wants to become a Bolivian food stall, it somehow costs us $20,000. And plug and go sounds great, but I haven't figured out how to plug and go in a retail realm, because it seems just everyone wants something a little bit different to realize their vision. Have you seen plug and go work on any scale?
Yeah, I think the notion of like modularization and standardization is something that we're seeing in like other facets of technology. And so I think the built environment is maybe a bit slower to get around to it, but our vision is to make that more the norm as opposed to the edge case in buildings and in cities. So that would enable that type of like quick transition.
And maybe like starting with you, Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about how you see technology as kind of enabling the stores of the future, and not necessarily in terms of selling a product, but in terms of creating these experiences and connecting with the public realm?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on this earlier when we were speaking about regulation, but a lot of it has to do with like zoning and business licenses and the right to operate in these spaces. And I think there's a lot that technology could do there to help give government the insight they want to have the public's interest in mind. You know, so a lot of these laws came out not to slow down business, not to restrict the number of things that can be open, but to safeguard public safety and public health. And so I think they're just a bit behind in that. And so if there are like emerging sensor technologies or online tools or anything that can be used to help them have the confidence they need to fulfill that obligation to civil society, I think that's something that technology could definitely do to help increase the rate of turn.
I mean, what examples would you guys cite of stores or retailers that are really doing it right, that seem to have figured out how to respond to the current environment and really kind of allow for a vibrant street life experience?
Two of my favorites, I love what Outdoor Voices is doing. I think their stores are great, and I think what's interesting is they have built in the experience in a way that feels really authentic and not just like a brand trying to do an experience in a store.
Can you set up who is?
So Outdoor Voices is like a kind of like an athleisure brand, and so they have, I think, like 1 or 2 stores here in New York. They have like a joggers club that they do where people can go and like show up and like it's like this massive group of people that will go and run together. And they've kind of like found a way to build that in and make that a part of the store, yeah, in a way that feels authentic. Glossier does a great job. They're actually not on the street level, but they have like a showroom that they've built like up on, I think, like the 5th floor of their building that's always packed, even though it's not on the street level. And I think it's similar to Outdoor Voices, where they've like tapped into a specific community. You know, they've built a beautiful space that's very Instagrammable, but also feels very authentic to their brand. And it's, yeah, it's literally on a 5th floor and always packed, so.
I don't know if I have a favorite. To be honest, if we're looking at the angles activating street lives, I think that's a really tough challenge, because if you are, I mean, I don't know if you, I mean, just looking at New York City, I mean, there's a lot of rules about like how you can actually engage the street. I mean, I think there's a lot of small business that does that really well. Like, how do you build a parklet outside of the cafe and engage, you know, passerbys through just that infrastructure, which, you know, needs a lot of approval process, a lot of cost of even building it. You know, I've heard it's like 6 months to 12 months even just getting that through. So it's a lot of challenge for brands to actually really activate like their streets in front of them, like physical constraints, legal constraints, you know, constraints with landlords. So, you know, how do we mitigate that in terms of like incentive is, I think, something that maybe different experiences from different cities would, you know, come into play, or even plazas that are more privatized, and like kind of how the stores can connect to the streetscapes of these privatized plaza more easily, so that it doesn't come into the purview of like DOT and whatnot. So
I challenge you to think about doors.
Okay.
Because there's nothing quite like a garage door which can go up
Right.
and spill into a street. So when you start with the other thing which when you think about how tech can change it, so I'm told that my daughters like to change their clothes a lot of times during the day. So once you have 3D printing, you can print a new drip frock to go to the club that night. So getting goods to people more quickly. Stores get old. Anthropology's old now, don't quote me. At first, you know, but when they first invented the fact that tables were not going to be straight, linear, kind of like the furniture here, but tables in stores would be at an angle, that was a brilliant thing. No one had done that before. And it may be that technology will allow stores in a quick age to change more quickly. Because it, you know, it's not, we may not go to the Gap anymore, but the Gap occupies a lot of real estate. And all stores are just not going to be showrooms. They're too expensive.
I think that is something interesting, is that I think a lot of the conversation often is on what can established brands learn from emerging brands, from online brands. But I do think it's interesting to ask the reverse. I think you were saying earlier that in your experience, a lot of these stores that start online don't have a very good understanding of what it means to be in a physical space and how to sell a product, but also to kind of interact with customers. I mean, what do you think that online brands that need to learn from existing retail, kind of stores, that retail brands that have existing brick and mortar, to incorporate into the physical realm, even of the future?
They need to work with both of them, because it's fascinating to me that online has no idea how to merchandise real space. And it's an art, and it's not taking a picture and posting it and selling it. A great Glossier site is not going to necessarily lead to a great Glossier store. Warby Parker is a unique thing, and you know what? You're so busy making that shirt or making the jewelry, it doesn't mean you'll know how to put things in a window or take a free sample out to the street, and because there's no traffic on the street, you know, put it in a street fair or a farmer's market. It's a really different experience.
I think the Amazon bookstores are a good example of that, where you have like the world's like largest online retailer, and then they go to brick and mortar, and it's like, oh, this is kind of a crappy bookstore. You know? So like that totally missed the mark. I thought it was a great opportunity to do something completely different in the retail space, and they kind of followed a very conventional path. And
well, they're also using their algorithm, right? Which is kind of weird.
Right. I guess maybe in the products they're showcasing, but in the actual layout of the store and the experience of the store, there could have been a lot more there.
I think it's just a completely different core competency. I think like building this like beautiful, fully optimized site is so different from like creating and managing a physical space. Like I think retail, with like physical retail, it's almost like hospitality. It's like having, like how do you have people in there that can represent your brand? Like what does this space like smell like? Like what music is playing? Like it's this whole immersive experience that you can create, and it like could not be more different from, you know, building like a fast, reliable website, I think.
And I think one of the things that we see as an opportunity is also how do we tie bigger brands and smaller brands together. I mean, they both bring very different things to the table. There's authenticity and stories for independent brands. There's experience and clout for bigger brands. Like those two things work really well together, we think. And like how do those actually happen in a space? That's a good question, and I think that's something that is meaningful to explore.
But I'm going to go back to the question you started with, where you started, which is maybe retail is a smaller piece of the street experience. Because really, I think it's incredibly cool that you have Kleiner Perkins funding, but really, it just blows my mind. It's terrific, but I don't know who's going to fund the next Gap, because it seems kind of crazy and stupid to do. Because your overhead is so high, right? Why would you do that? And just Jeff Bezos will kick you out of business in 2 seconds. So what that says to me is maybe it's a piece of something else. Maybe it's, you know, your restaurant that is a co-working space. That it's not just time of day, but there's going to have to be a grown-up in the room. There's always has to be a principal. There has to be somebody in charge. And for those of us who dealt with government a lot, I'm sorry if there are EDC people here, if the government's in charge, it will be dysfunctional and slow. And I don't know how to answer that.
To me, it's that question of needs and just like being in tune with what people's needs are. And so historically, it's been focused around like very obvious goods and services, but I feel like we're kind of entering an age where the needs are a bit more nuanced, and people have like, you know, aspirations and psychological and emotional needs and things that I think these retailers or these storefronts could step in and help fulfill. And I think that's kind of an untapped facet. You know, everyone's so really focused on like merchandise and things, but I think there are other human needs that could be explored.
Get specific. So what is happening? It's not a shrink's office, right?
Like I think Inscape's a great example on 23rd or whatever, where it's like a meditation space. It's a retail storefront that now has like a meditation subscription. I'm not saying that's going to take over all of Manhattan, but I think like expanding the realm of what's possible in these spaces and thinking about other needs that people have in their lives and their families and their commitments is a useful thing to explore.
Streets are not about meditating. Streets are about my looking at your dress and thinking, oh, maybe I want to look like that. Or my admiring your kid in the baby carriage. I mean, streets aren't about meditating.
That's a great point, but you're very, very focused on the material thing, on the object and the good, and I'm thinking experience is the bigger part.
Streets could be about whatever we want them to be about, right?
I think streets need to be about crowded with people. They're not country lanes. I think streets are about, but that's my opinion.
I do want to go back.
It's a great debate. It's getting good. Don't stop this down.
I love this.
The gloves are coming off.
I can meditate at home. There is no strategic
Right, but you can eat at home
advantage.
too, but you choose to eat at restaurants all the time.
But it's clear to me nobody's choosing to meditate. People are not choosing to meditate outside.
Well, I don't know. I think it's fine. I don't think you're actually arguing. I think you're both agreeing that it's about the experience.
We're not arguing. It's not.
But I do want to get back to the point you were making before about how complicated or challenging it is to work with government when you're doing kind of private sector work. I mean, how should, in an ideal world, and we like to think about, you know, the city of the future, the neighborhood of the future. In an ideal world, how would private and public collaboration function for the betterment of the city, the urban experience, and ultimately for the consumer?
I think it could just be easier. I mean, for us, this is so new, like figuring out how to get into these spaces, trying to navigate those like government websites to like figure out what we need to have posted. Like it was like this puzzle I feel like we had to solve. And so for us, like where we're new, and I know there's a lot of other like new retailers getting into space, like just coming up with easier ways to like access that information, as like simple as that sounds. Like there's a lot of departments, like the Department of Labor, like there's people that are coming into this space all the time, and there's so much stuff that I didn't know that like we got in trouble for because I didn't know that. So it could be as simple as just having like a website that functions where you have all the information you need. Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done just to like make that more simple for people.
I mean, there's examples that have worked, but I don't know if it's a good version of it. But like, you know, urban space is everywhere in like these public plazas. I mean, and they're charging like exorbitant rents for these like small businesses that go in there. I mean, it does create some kind of a different life. Like people flock to, you know, these urban holiday market, and it does create vibrancy, right? And I think that needs more transparency. Like, how are these contracts being done?
That's a good question.
Right? Like, why are they getting all of them? All of them, right? And you know, and why are they charging that amount, right? So,
why is there more competition?
Exactly. So I think that needs to be more transparent in the process, and so it has happened, you know, and it's yeah. So you have more.
Your challenge is going to be in Toronto not to do a company town. For those of you who remember Cummings Engine, if you ever took an urban studies class, you can take mine. So in making it easier, Google can do all the regulations, right? Sidewalk Labs can make it easy, but who wants it curated by, you know, that element of choice is really hard when it's owned by one group.
Or could that be socialized? It could be something you put back to the community and say, like, who wants to upvote what type of stores we're getting on this block?
Good luck with that. You know, if you want any level of private investment whatsoever, and I assume on some level Google likes making money.
We try to.
Yeah. You're not going to have people voting. You're going to have the Japanese guys who opening their first store, willing to take their money and take the risk, and God bless them, they sign a 10-year lease at, you know, $200 a foot, and they're selling a lot of sushi. That's not something the community should control.
I'm totally for citizen engagement, and people are living in the neighborhood. I think it's their right to have some say and input into like what's going on.
So are they allowed to
services are available
Are they
to them.
censoring? Are
They're censoring, but they can upvote certain things. You know, like I was talking about Harvard Square and the tragedy I think that's happened in Harvard Square, where there used to be a lot of like quirky retailers and interesting shops, and now the only people that can afford the rents are like banks. So like on 3 corners of Harvard Square, it's like Citizen Bank, Bank of America, and Chase, I think. And so it's like completely decimated the vibrancy of the space. And I think if you let it up to the people who live there, they probably wouldn't have voted those people to occupy, or those businesses to occupy those spaces.
Is a dry cleaner vibrant?
But it's something you can use. Like if you don't have laundry in your house, that's something you're going to get a lot of use out of every day. Weekly at least.
I mean, so we've talked a little bit about how, like, the kind of better scenarios, right, of the kind of good examples that you see. Are there any kind of worst case scenarios that you see of, let's do both because we don't need to focus only on the negative, but let's start with kind of worst case scenarios where you could see the future of retail going wrong, and then let's kind of shift to best case scenarios where how could we really kind of pick up on the positive things that are happening and push them forward potentially for cities. Any ideas?
I think like a bad scenario could be where the supply sides of the retail space does not become more flexible, or like landlords aren't, you know, becoming more open to working with different types of retailers. And I think you can really watch a neighborhood decline pretty quickly. And I think that we are seeing these bright spots where people are becoming more flexible, and there is like some kind of indication that that will happen. But I think if it doesn't happen fast enough, you really watch how quickly, like even parts of Soho that look like just sad to walk around, and it affects the other businesses that are staying. And so I think, I believe that this will get figured out, and like this like supply demand issue will get figured out. But I think if it doesn't happen quickly, you're going to have some like issues within the actual neighborhoods.
Design guidelines, which we haven't talked about. So when you talk about community participation, there's really simple things you can do to make streets look better. Like we have a regulation which requires that 70% of your window be transparent so you can see into the store and see what's happening. That's something that people might not upvote, but it's certainly furthering a public good. And in those places where that happens, it's terrific. Now, the flip side of that is the best streets in New York City are in the outer boroughs, and they look really crappy, and there's no sign control. But gosh, are they lively. So I haven't figured it out. But
I think a sad scenario for the future would be going to the store would just be like you shopping at home. Like, you know, like the digital experience kind of proliferated everywhere, and the sort of, I mean, I keep saying human to human, but like the actual experiences of like interacting with like a shop owner, you know, going to a laundromat and like talking to your neighbors, like that kind of experience is really key to, I think, a vibrant and livable city. And I think there could be technological ways to enhance those kind of things, but like not like another screen, please, not another like screen that reacts to products in the store. Like, you know, I think that's old.
Yeah. I think the ethos of what you're saying is totally in line with my vision. I think it's like reduced barriers to entry, reduced information asymmetry, level playing field, everyone can compete. And stores can like thrive and wither away quickly, and the whole system's like resilient and can regenerate. I think that would be the idealized scenario in my mind.
And just because we have 2 more minutes, then I'm going to start taking audience questions. But since we haven't talked too much about technology, is there one technology in particular that you feel will be most relevant in the near future?
I don't know about most relevant. Like for us, something that we're really focusing on is reducing the friction for a brand to actually get their products into the store. So right now, if you're like a small emerging brand, you have to figure out like who the buyer is at these like wholesale places. It's a very, very slow process. It takes months to get in. It's expensive. And so for us, like we're building technology where brands can literally just sign up online, onboard their products, and ship them into our stores, and just making this something that is super turnkey and that like anyone can access. Like you know, could be a brand that just started on Instagram and you can still sell. And so I think the more that other retailers can incorporate that kind of technology, where it is as simple as just like onboarding products online and shipping, and not making it this like archaic process of trying to like hunt down the buyer somewhere and like show them your wares. Like that's kind of insane.
Is it inevitable that Amazon becomes the redemption system because they're so far ahead?
It could be, yeah. Like, I mean, they could be using like that technology to onboard and then maybe like sell into Amazon stores.
Yeah, well, that's the question, right? If you want spontaneity and diversity, is the back office. Does the back office need to be spontaneous as well, or small, or startup? I don't know.
I think you can have both, yeah.
Any thoughts, guys, on technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're thinking a lot is like what, you know, that process is really important, how to, you know, have that logistics really easy for smaller brands. But the other piece is also like, how do you support kind of like a concierge service that is, you know, again, human to human, but like, you know, what is the technology that can enhance that, right? And then let's say someone works for this like changing storefront, you know, and every hour is different. And, you know, how does the salesperson or the concierge there able to sort of understand all that and be able to service the, you know, the customer as well as, you know, one store, right? So I think the technology to support that is really important.
Like the interface and the user experience for the people that work alongside these technologies. Yeah, I totally agree. For me, it's robotics and the self-driving vehicles, whether it's delivery trucks or autonomous cars, and then reconfigurable spaces. I think all this is in the realm of robotics control, and I think that's going to be the big game changer of the next decade.
Well, I'm going to start reading from the kind of questions that you guys have submitted in the audience. I'm going to start with this one. Are these retail trends also prevalent with low-income households' neighborhoods, or are we just talking about a specific wealthy, young New York demographic?
Can I add a question to that? Your scenario about community organizations.
So just to repeat for those who can't hear, the question was, in the scenario, community organizations who pays for it, which is a slightly separate question. So
it is.
It's okay. I can address it.
Sure.
We don't know. But maybe there's a world where like co-ops or housing authorities or something take over that space because it's commanding such a low rate for the rental, and they decide they can collect more rent on the spaces above by providing that as an amenity possibility.
It happens now. It's bonusable community space.
So
I think the healthiest streets are in New York, even though the prices are often gouged, are in the Bronx or Queens. Look at Forest Hills. Well, not that Forest Hills is low income, but this used to be a lot of rent, but 25 years ago, the rents in Harlem before it gentrified were $125 a foot. Small stores. You know, I don't think in many ways, in poorer communities, for whatever reason, people take public transportation, they walk, so they see what's on their street, and I don't know, the stores aren't as vacant on the street level.
And it's a function of lower rents, though, right? Like the barrier to entry to get in.
$125 a foot 20 years ago in Harlem. The rents in Jamaica are so much higher than you would think they are. I mean, it's not like crazy like Manhattan. Now, it has to do with density. You know, there's lots of small cities in New York, in the United States, where the rents are free and there's no stores. But so it's very location specific, and we're talking in a very general way about something that should always be tied to place.
Right. I guess kind of responding to that question is, I think as a model, like I think there could be a model where it adapts. I mean, basically, the issue is rent, right? So how do we, and we're thinking about this a lot, like as a shared economy for retail, like how do we sort of share spaces in a way that makes sense? Is it time? Is it space? Is it, you know, if all of these small brands can, you know, if 10 of them can take that space, great, awesome. If 50 of them can take a bigger space, great. Like if the unit economics work out, like there's definitely a model for different kinds of neighborhoods of different rents level. So like if there's a model like that could adapt to, you know, almost, it's like WeWork, you pay for a different price at different location because of whatever the rents or the cost is for the space. So same model could definitely adapt to,
you used your space brilliantly.
Thanks.
Tell them.
So that's something that we're really focused on, like making sure that very small brands that don't have crazy funds can still get into the space. So like in our Williamsburg store, for example, you can literally pay $300 a month to get space in the store. And we have enough brands where like the unit economics make sense for us and everyone's selling. Something else that we think about like in that same line is making the products themselves very accessible. Like we didn't want to just like build stores for wealthy people where it's just like, I feel like a lot of stores in Soho, at least for me personally, like it's like a museum. Like I cannot buy anything in there. So a lot of the products we sell are very accessibly priced, and it's made for the neighborhood. It's made so people can go in and it's fun. Like literally anyone could, or pretty much everyone can buy something in there. And then on the brand side, it's the same thing. It's like very easy for them to get in there and get space.
But not to quote you back to yourself, you have a membership model and you use your space as an event space.
Yes.
So if you ever, I'm sorry to use capitalist metrics, do you have an idea of your sales per square foot?
Yes.
Would you share them?
We don't share it, sorry.
Okay. I bet they're pretty good. And a lot of stores would still be open if they had those sales per square foot.
Thanks. I have a question here about something that we haven't touched on at all, so I think it might be nice to bring it up. Did not see any scenario, oh, this is from Anna Siprikova. I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name. Did not see any scenarios for ubiquitous strip shopping malls in suburban neighborhoods. What will we do with all these space and parking? Any thoughts on malls, guys?
It's a hard question.
It's a hard question. Especially because malls are often such suburban contexts.
Yeah,
not always.
a bit of it's in the framing. So we were really focused on street and street vibrancy, and so stores and retail spaces that didn't face onto the street were kind of outside of the scope of our exploration. So like that's kind of the lame answer for it, but the very truthful one. I think there's a lot of interest and interesting ideas around redeveloping suburban malls and how that land could be repurposed or densified in certain ways. And I think that's something we're very interested in exploring further. But yeah, you're right. Unfortunately, we didn't cover much of that in the talk today.
Land recycles. I mean, there are lots and lots of big companies buying malls for land, and they want to make them housing.
Yep.
And hopefully they'll figure out something better to do with their parking lots than making them driverless cars place parking places.
Maybe.
A lot of zoning changes, so it's slow.
We'll take audience questions later. But, so on the theme of zoning, we have a question here from NonWorking. How do you expect cities' often restrictive zoning codes to keep up with the advances proposed, i.e. multiple uses within one single space? We've talked a lot about this, I think, but how can cities keep up with this?
They won't. Slowly.
We talk a lot about this notion of performance-based code or outcome-based code, where there can be real-time deliverables, measurements, targets that can be communicated that can offer permits.
So here I'm going to give you a compliment. Maybe it's your wild card, which is if you do it well enough in Toronto, then everybody will get jealous, like everybody wanted to be Hong Kong for a while, and they'll copy you.
That's the plan.
Good. I figured.
And kind of on a related question then, what about a tax on ground level space left vacant for more than a certain period of time? Just kind of thinking about strategies, like what are the concrete things?
How about some carrots, guys?
Carrots or sticks, right? Well, both need to happen in tangent, right?
No. Because, look, this is the simple economics of buildings. There are banks. You may hate banks and drugstores, but the banks are giving people money to, this is what happened in 2008. The banks had given people money to buy these buildings. They thought in their underwriting that they would be getting $10 a foot. Now they're going to get $1 a foot. And they still have to pay their taxes because there's no stores. So now you're going to tax them for keeping it empty. This is what happens. The bank says, not your building anymore, my building. Okay, not a great idea. So if it were me, I would underwrite what transformations to the space, make the permitting easy, rent it to make it schools. I mean, we got a lot of kindergartens. I mean, taxes? I don't think so.
So there should be no negative repercussions for essentially waiting for a bank to enter the public realm.
The bank's gonna, the minute you do a repercussion like that, the bank is in the public realm. Because you have decreased value significantly. Sorry, that's basic math.
All right, we have a question here from Anonymous. Well, let's go to this one. From Nate. Vacancies, whether caused by high rent or low retail demand, boil down to the landlords and banks. What innovative finance mechanisms could benefit retail?
I'm still thinking about the last question, to be honest with you. So a lot of these refinancing happened before the downturn. And so the pricing that was locked in for the financing was at a time when they felt more confident in the rents that they could command. And then as the market's falling out, people aren't willing to pay those rents anymore. Now they're kind of left holding it back, but it's kind of the risk that they've taken on, right?
That's not.
And so if they're punished for taking a risky bet and like arranging their financing on the assumption they can get $100 a foot,
the problem
it's kind of their fault.
It doesn't matter whose fault it is. Our game is vibrant streets, and vibrant streets that you want to walk in, lined by things you want to enjoy. So if I thought a form of tax would enable that, I'm there. I think it won't enable it. I think it will cause more disruption in a bad way and make it take longer.
Sorry.
No worries. I think there wasn't very much
I'm sorry, I'm not
active
being really
engagement in the
bossy.
finance mechanism.
No, it's good. I'm glad we're having this debate.
This is kind of an interesting question. What is from Amy Chen? What is the opportunity for mobile AR, tech, and retail in cities? Example use cases: geolocated search and discovery for consumers, audio or visual storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, I think, again, like going back to that storytelling piece of how to connect the consumers to the brands and to the person behind it, like I think there's a lot there to do. Like if there's not a if that maker or that person, let's say, cannot have a face-to-face contact with, with a potential consumer, then the technology can still sort of, if it's done well, enable that kind of experience. And I think that's, that's still kind of like an in-between to like the, old school, old fashioned, like, hey, butcher, like how much is, that exchange. But I think with this world where, some of these makers are remote, or like some of these brands are doing, expanding to different places, there still could be, that component where that connection can still be made through technology. And I think, again, it has to be done really well, and it has to be done, really authentically. So I think that's the key. Yeah.
Which it hasn't quite yet, you'd argue.
Yeah.
I think one of the things which just popped into my mind, so it might be completely stupid, is I was going by the Met, the Michelangelo, and the Met's obviously a huge edifice. So one of the things, so take your core institutions, your libraries, your museums. You could nationally prepare people to understand what they're going to see when they look at this divine draftsman. So if you take your core institutions who have infrastructure and know how to display and fan them out, and that's actually something you can do internationally because there's really not much distance anymore. That's a thing that technology could enable through sort of,
Storytelling.
Yeah.
I'm going to take one more question from Slido, and then I'll open it up to the room. If it's not retail, who or what is a likely tenant to revive street life? Make you think outside the retail box. Yeah.
It's not meditation, that's for sure.
No life.
I think you see brands that are just starting to use the space for marketing, to be honest. Like, you're seeing it on Broadway a lot now, where maybe they do sell a product and maybe that's like one of the reasons they're doing it, but that's like certainly not the main reason that they opened. I think, big brands that have the capital can like easily go and build like this like immersive space that's like visually striking and Instagrammable, and like they can do that, and they can do it in a high foot traffic area and use it as marketing, and in a lot of cases it would be a better use case than retail. And I think for the customer, that is nice to have too. I think instead of having all these vacant spaces walking down Broadway, to have these kind of like, experiential spaces, or just like these brands that have taken over and come up with some cool concept, like that's great for both parties in my mind.
Think souk. I mean, I say it all the time. Make it and sell it. Because it's fun to watch things being made, and you might come in to see it being made. Think Sturbridge Village. And I think that is you can use tech, and I think it will fill a lot of space, because you aren't going to have to go to the Gowanus and rent a crappy factory to make it and then transport it.
All right, I know there's a lot of hands.
I got one here too.
Oh,
I brought this exact question up with an Australian developer a few months ago, and they were like, no problem at all. Like, we're going to get coffee shops and restaurants, not even concerned about it. And like, there's literally a coffee shop, like 3 per block throughout all of Sydney. And so they just think it's going to consumption and experiential things and away from products.
All right. Sorry. So many hands. Eric, are you gonna? All right, let's go in the back. I see a hand with no face. There we go. I think it's Charlotte.
I'd like to ask Susan's question of Eric again about where have you seen plug and play work, and add a little bit to that. So modular and generic is the opposite of authenticity, which is what we've been saying sells a brand. And when you want to create a space or even a kitchen that's perfect for your group, that's not easily modular, or not easily brought in by another person. Then the second is no one likes roommates. Like, if we all had the option, we would want the refrigerator left exactly, or the dishes left exactly. So the notion that you're gonna have 2 people sharing a space and one person is relying upon the other one seems not great. So why do you think retail is not gonna have to flex, where Gap buys a nighttime bar to reuse their space, versus infrastructure, trying to make infrastructure and buildings flex?
I think sharing's a nightmare. So I think good luck. I have just opened a Christmas market with 18 kiosks. I change out kiosks every 2 months. That means one salesperson, one kiosk. You got to sell a lot of stuff from 50 feet. I got to do a lot of work to keep it. Plug and go exists. I'm being really snide and obnoxious. You know, we had a kiosk that sold face cream. They did really well. They said, I want to open a store with facials. And then I cheat, and I tell the government it's a pop-up, so I don't have to go do lots of regulatory things. If there's government people, please don't tattle on me. And I got a store. Or, you know, it's pop-ups happen. There's plug and go space, tenant ready space all over New York City because it's all empty. It's still a lot of energy, extraordinary energy to run a store. And the real estate's the least of it.
Something that we've done to help with the sharing, rather than it being this kind of split up space where there's like different tenants operating in there at once, our stores are completely run by our staff. So yes, there's 50 different brands selling in there, but it's our staff, like we handle inventory. Yeah, it's the space is fully managed by us, and we don't have like a bunch of different vendors running around. And then to answer the question about how to use the space for different purposes, but it's still feeling authentic. Something we've done there is the brands that are selling in the store, they're like members of the store, can basically host events in the space. So like basically every night at this point, they can go in and they have like a panel, or they have a workshop, or like whatever they want to do to take over the store and like bring in their online audience. So it's, you know, the space is getting used for all, like lots of different like strange events sometimes, like whatever they want to do really. But we're, you know, activating the space at all hours. So sometimes it'll be like 9 p.m. or we're literally kicking people out of the store, but the programming is all handled by the brands.
But aren't those brands starting up at that stage in which they might be lost leaders to have all those events as opposed to a sustainable gas store?
So
it seems like a lot of money, or every store would be having nightcaps or, you know, cocktails every evening to bring you in.
I mean, a lot of it can be pretty simple. Like sometimes just having like a panel where there's like a handful of people that people are interested in hearing from. Like it's not an expensive event. Like we make it easy and like a modular setup where they can set up in 10 minutes. And I think there are just so many brands that are emerging and that are, you know, starting up online that want some kind of space. And even if it's them bringing, you know, 50 people that follow them on Instagram into the space, like that's great for them. Yeah.
How is some of you may remember? I'm sure you don't remember. Barney's or used to have the special store within the store, where they have a bunch of new emerging designers. They used to have it in Saks, and it's presented by some name. So why is it, are you different than that? How?
So the way that we work is we basically have an editorial concept for each store. So rather than it just being like, hey, come into our space, like there's emerging brands here that you've never heard of, we'll come up with a concept for each space. So the one that we just opened in Flatiron, for example, the theme was like 90s mall. So it's like this like 90s like nostalgic store. And so there's probably 60 different brands selling in there. They're all around the theme. For the customer, they come in and they see like, you know, this fun space, like it's, you know, designed like a 90s mall, and it's like this kind of funny nostalgic thing for them. So they're not just going because it's emerging brands. Like they're going in for the concept and the store design. And so I think wrapping it in that concept makes the space make sense while still giving these emerging brands a place to sell.
I guess the angle also is different. Like if you're looking at a blend, like using the store as a perspective, then yeah, like a sustainable, bigger store may or may not be the same. But if you're looking at the brand's perspective, if we're about like cultivating, you know, diversity and cultivating smaller brands to be more successful, then I think this is meaningful. Like, you know, having, you know, yeah, roommates sometimes are terrible, but you know, a lot of people still have roommates because, you know,
it's a necessity.
Yeah, it's a necessity. So, so I think there's that angle where, you know, yes, there's more work, there's more coordination, there's more, but there's also, that's the downside, but there's also like the plus side of it, right? Like more brands, it's like a group art show, right? Like everyone brings, kind of like what you're saying, everyone brings like 50 people and there's 10 brands, suddenly you have like 500 people. So I think that's really the benefit of like, you know, again, there's sort of this collaborative and shared economy model, like having more brands in the space. You
know. We've got 2 minutes. We can take one
more question.
Sure. Do you or who has the
Anybody
question?
else? One more?
Your hands all over.
Hi, thank you guys. You made a great point about thinking about how people actually want to spend their time, and that will be how you get traffic. So to that point, if you think, can you guys talk a little bit about the intersection of retail and public space and what responsibility either retailers have to create public space or cities have to create public space that also services retail, and where those blend?
So sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Can you talk about the intersection of retail and public space?
Okay, rapid fire, each of you guys, intersection of public space.
I like the idea of kind of blending this notion where like public spaces could have certain retail or commercial aspects, and also being able to go to private spaces and use them for personal use. So like the third space coffee shop kind of thing is a great example where you're going to go there because you don't want to be at home and you're not at work and you just need a place to kind of hang out, and so maybe you buy a coffee, but it is essentially part of the public realm that is a slight commercial interest, but mainly just because you need a place to spend your hour. So I think moments like this are going to become much more common, and I think it's actually a good thing for urbanism where people can feel more at home in more privatized retail or commercial settings.
I guess from a retail perspective, like, you know, if retailers can be more open to how their space are used and maybe engage an audience that may or may not be their target audience, like, you know, hosting events like this, or like, you know, doing, you know, more civic engagement stuff, or like allowing, you know, people to co-work in their space, or like just opening up a little bit of like that conversation of like how the space is used. I think that's almost like talking to your neighbor and saying hi. Like, so like how do retailers do that in a way that's also sustainable for them and like, you know, effective for them, but like opening that dialogue up, I think it's important. Yeah.
Public has to shoot first, because the public can generate traffic. Way generates traffic. Barcelona in its public art generates traffic. You can keep the stores alive by creating great public spaces which draw people out of their homes, and then we'll get rid of the storefronts and we'll all be happy.
Yeah, I would say like as like a lot of the platforms that you see cropping up where these smaller brands can sell, as that becomes bigger and easier to use, I think you can start to sell like anywhere. Like I think these markets that pop up in public spaces, I think it becomes like, we know like how difficult it is to do now to actually build something like that, but I do think like as the technology catches up to it and just dealing with inventory issues and everything else, like it does become easier to like quickly emerge in like these public spaces, which is kind of cool.
Wonderful. I like that we end the conversation on the note of the importance of public space, which I think is excellent. All right, so just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists. We have Alana Branston, Susan Fine, Eric Ho, Eric Baczuk. I want to thank also the Street Life After Retail team, all the guys who are doing the research that made it possible for Eric to present these scenarios. So that's Johanna Greenbaum, Jesse Shapins, Violet Whitney, and Matt Ransom. Thank you guys so much. Thanks to Eric Jaffe, who started off the night, Megan Wald, Amelia Clark, and Nina Napa, who are all behind the scenes doing amazing things, getting the logistics to make this happen. Thank you guys. And also to the Sidewalk Labs volunteers, the guys in the t-shirts and the yellow badges. They gave up their time tonight to make sure that this ran smoothly. So thank you guys, and thank you all for coming. Thanks so much.